The blizzard had howled all night, a furious storm that seemed to tear at the very bones of the mountain. Snow came down in sheets so thick that the trees vanished into whiteness, and even the familiar path to the old cabin blurred into uncertainty. Ivan, the old man who had spent more winters alone in those woods than most villagers dared count, forced himself out of his cabin with the first light of dawn. He had learned long ago that to survive the mountains, one could not rest when the storm passed. The traps had to be checked, firewood gathered, and signs of danger studied before the day surrendered to night again. His joints ached with every step, but his cane, carved years ago from a sturdy branch, gave him just enough balance to fight the waist-high drifts. That morning felt different, though Ivan could not explain why at first. The air carried a stillness beneath the roar of wind, a silence that did not belong. He followed the trail toward his usual snares, eyes squinting against the blinding reflection of white light on snow. His breath came in ragged puffs, instantly crystallizing before his face. More than once he thought of turning back, but the need to ensure his survival, and perhaps something deeper, kept him moving. Halfway through the pine grove, he stopped. There was something dark against the pale curtain of snow. At first it seemed like shadows of broken branches swinging with the wind. But as he moved closer, his heart began to pound faster, his mouth dry with a strange dread. 3 small shapes hung from the lowest limb of a pine tree, swaying ever so slightly. Ivan's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat when he saw what they truly were. 3 wolf cubs, their fragile bodies strung up by thin ropes biting into their necks. Their fur was stiff with frost, snow clinging to their ears and paws. For a long moment Ivan could not move, could not believe the cruelty before his eyes. He had seen terrible things in his lifetime. War had left corpses scattered across fields of mud and snow. Hunger had stolen infants from their mother's arms, but this act seemed different. It was deliberate, cold-blooded, and senseless. He stumbled forward, his cane sinking deep into the drifts, and reached up with trembling hands. The ropes were knotted tight, cutting into his stiff fingers as he struggled to loosen them. 2 of the cubs were already gone, their small bodies lifeless, fur-coated in ice like fragile statues of death. But the third, when Ivan pressed it against his chest, he felt the faintest shiver. A weak sound, hardly more than a whimper, rose against the storm's howl. His old heart jolted with both horror and hope. The tiny creature still clung to life, though only by a thread. Ivan pulled the knot free, cradling the cub against him as though it were made of glass. He looked around, half expecting to see the culprit hiding in the snow-covered trees. Who could have done such a thing? Hunters from the village sometimes set traps for wolves, yes, but this was no trap. It was punishment, or perhaps a cruel message. Wolves were feared in the valley, accused of killing sheep and stealing food when the winters grew harsh. But to hang their young like this was an act born of hatred, not necessity. Ivan muttered under his breath, a prayer or perhaps a curse, as he tucked the small survivor beneath his thick coat. The cub was so cold he feared it might never grow warm again, but he refused to abandon it. Not after seeing such mercilessness. The journey back to the cabin felt endless. The storm pushed against him, every step a battle. He leaned heavily on his cane, the weight of the cub close to his chest reminding him of all the fragile things he had once tried and failed to protect. He remembered faces of soldiers in the war, boys younger than the cub's lifespan, freezing in trenches with no one to save them. He remembered the day his wife had died during another winter storm, her breath fading away as he sat helpless beside her. Perhaps it was madness that drove him now, but he felt as if fate had placed this cub in his arms, giving him one last chance to choose mercy over despair. When at last the cabin came into view, nearly buried under heaps of snow, Ivan forced his stiff legs to climb the final slope. He pushed open the door, and a gust of wind slammed it shut behind him. The cabin was dim, lit only by the weak flames in the fireplace. He hurried to the hearth, laying the cub gently on a folded blanket before the fire. Its body was limp, eyes closed, but a faint twitch of its paws gave him hope. He rubbed its fur with his calloused hands, trying to coax warmth back into its fragile frame. Then, remembering a trick his mother had once used to save a sickly lamb, he warmed a small pot of milk and fed it drop by drop from a spoon. The cub stirred, lips moving weakly as the warmth reached its body. Ivan let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind shrieking like ghosts clawing at the windows, but inside the cabin, there was a fragile spark of life. He sat back on his stool, staring at the cub, feeling an ache in his chest that was both sorrow and strange joy. He had saved one soul, at least for now. Outside, the mountains were merciless, but in that small cabin, against the firelight and shadows, Ivan chose not to be. Ivan barely slept that night. Every time the wind battered the shutters or the snow shifted against the roof, he woke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle propped beside the bed. Yet it was not fear of intruders or even of wolves that kept him restless, it was the fragile, uneven breathing of the cub lying on a blanket near the fire. He had wrapped the creature in old cloth, checked its chest with his fingers, and whispered words he had not spoken aloud in years, gentle words meant to coax the cub into holding on. When dawn finally broke, weak and gray through the frosted windows, Ivan rose stiffly and went to the hearth. The cub's eyes fluttered open, milky at first, then clearing with a spark of life. It gave a faint cry, so small it pierced Ivan deeper than any gunshot he had ever heard. He warmed more milk, coaxing the cub to drink by dipping a rag and letting it suckle the drops. This time, the cub latched on with a fragile determination. Ivan felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had thought dead long ago. He had not cared for anything living since the war took his comrades and the winters took his wife. The years had turned him into a man of solitude, more comfortable with silence and trees than with human company. Yet now, this helpless ball of fur had tethered him back to life with invisible threads stronger than rope. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Ivan tended to his chores. He split wood, shoveled snow from the door, checked that his meager stores of grain and dried meat would last at least another week. But his thoughts kept drifting to the cub. He would pause, glance back into the cabin, and see it lying by the fire, twitching in sleep. Its small chest rose and fell with effort, but it breathed. That was enough. When Ivan returned to sit near the hearth, the cub stirred, crawling weakly toward him. He reached down, and it pressed its cold nose against his weathered hand. The touch sent a shiver through him, not of cold but of memory. How long had it been since anything had sought comfort in his presence? Outside, the storm calmed, leaving behind a silence broken only by the occasional groan of branches. Under snow, from far off, carried faintly through the frozen air, came the sound of howling. Ivan froze, listening. It was not the solitary cry of a lone wolf but the chorus of a pack. The sound was mournful, almost desperate. He closed his eyes, understanding immediately. Somewhere in the forest, the wolves were calling for their young, the very cubs he had cut down from that pine tree. The lifeless bodies he had left behind would never answer, but the one in his care still could. His stomach knotted with unease. Wolves were not creatures to forgive. When they discovered the scent of human hands on their dead, they would remember. The pack would grow bold, perhaps reckless, in their grief. That night, Ivan stoked the fire higher, though it meant using more wood than he should have. He could not let the cub grow cold again. He sat for hours in the flickering glow, watching the tiny creature curl against the blanket, twitching as though it dreamed of running in snow it had never known. He began to talk softly, not caring that the cub could not understand. He told it of the mountains, of the rivers now frozen, of how winters used to be when he was young and the village thrived. He spoke of comrades who never returned from the war, of his wife Anna whose laughter once filled this same cabin. The cub listened in silence, its ears twitching, as though his voice itself carried warmth. Days passed. The cub grew stronger, little by little. Its eyes, once clouded, now gleamed with a wild brightness. It began to stagger on unsteady legs, exploring the cabin, sniffing at Ivan's boots, gnawing weakly on scraps of leather. Ivan found himself laughing, a sound so unfamiliar it startled him. He gave the cub a name, Seryozha, after his childhood friend who had not survived the front lines. Naming it felt dangerous, like placing his heart where it could be broken again, yet he could not resist. Each time he called, Seryozha, the cub lifted its head, ears pricking as though it knew the sound belonged to it. But Ivan's joy was shadowed by unease. The villagers would not understand. They already hated the wolves, blaming them for every missing chicken, every torn goat, every shadow that passed too close to their barns. If word spread that Ivan sheltered a wolf cub, they would come with rifles and torches. He knew the cruelty of men. He had seen it hanging from the pine tree. He could not let them find Seryozha. When neighbors occasionally trudged up the path to check on him, Ivan kept the cub hidden in the back room, holding his breath until they left. His heart pounded with guilt, for the cub yipped and scratched, not understanding the need for silence. Still, Ivan chose to risk it. He had saved the cub once from the ropes of men, and he would save it again if needed. In his mind, the creature was no longer just a wolf, no longer the enemy whispered of in village tales. It was a reminder that even in the coldest, most merciless winters, life still fought to endure. And in that small fight, Ivan felt himself enduring too. The fire burned brighter, the silence felt less heavy, and the nights no longer stretched endlessly empty. For the first time in many years, the old man felt less alone. The cub grew stronger with each passing day, and with its strength came a wild, untamed energy that filled the cabin in ways Ivan had long forgotten. Seryozha no longer lay curled in blankets for hours at a time. Instead, he tottered around on clumsy legs, nosing into corners, pawing at Ivan's boots, and chewing whatever scraps of cloth or wood he could find. His small teeth left tiny marks on Ivan's walking cane, and once he even dragged a mitten across the floor as though it were prey. Ivan scolded him gently, though the corners of his mouth twitched with something dangerously close to a smile. Laughter had not lived in the cabin for many years, but now it returned, hesitant and shy, as if testing whether it was welcome. Ivan spoke often to the cub, his voice rough but steady. "Seryozha," he would say, "you'll grow strong soon, stronger than me. The forest will call you one day, and I'll have to let you go." The cub would tilt his head at the sound of his name, eyes bright with curiosity, and bound toward him with a wag of his tail. Each time, Ivan's chest ached. He had named the cub after his childhood friend, a boy who had once run through these same forests before war had swallowed him whole. Seryozha had been brave, laughing in the face of danger, only to fall before his life had truly begun. Giving that name to the wolf pup felt like a defiance of death, a promise that at least one Seryozha would grow and thrive. But the world beyond the cabin was less forgiving. One evening, as Ivan carried in firewood, he saw the glow of lanterns through the snow-laden trees. A group of men from the village approached, their faces grim beneath heavy furs. They greeted him with stiff nods and wasted no time in explaining their visit. Livestock had been slaughtered in the valley, goats, sheep, even a calf. The villagers had found paw prints in the snow, wide and heavy, leading back toward the forest. "The wolves are growing bold," one of the men spat, his voice harsh with anger. "If we don't drive them out, we'll starve before winter's end." Another man pounded his fist on Ivan's table when they came inside to warm themselves. "You know these woods better than any of us, Ivan. You've heard them howling. Tell us, how close are they?" Ivan's stomach twisted as he glanced toward the back room, where Seryozha was hidden behind the door. He could hear the faint scrabbling of claws on the floorboards, the restless sounds of a creature that did not understand the need for silence. His heart thumped in his chest, loud as a drum, but he forced his expression to remain calm. "They're close," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Hunger drives them near when the storms are this harsh." The men cursed under their breath, muttering about organizing a hunt, setting traps, poisoning bait if necessary. Ivan said nothing, though every word cut him like a blade. He sat at the edge of the firelight, his hands clenched tightly together, praying that none of them would notice the small scratches on the floorboards or the faint musky scent of wolf lingering in the cabin. When the hunters finally left, stomping out into the night with their rifles and lanterns, Ivan slumped against the wall, exhausted from the effort of deception. Seryozha crept from the back room, ears lowered as if sensing the danger. Ivan knelt and pulled him close, burying his face in the soft, coarse fur. "They won't take you," he whispered, voice trembling. "Not while I still have breath in me." The cub licked his hand, as if sealing the promise. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Ivan could hear gunshots echoing in the forest, sharp cracks that shattered the stillness of snow. Sometimes he saw the hunters' tracks, long trails winding deeper into the woods. Once, he even stumbled upon a bloodstain in the snow, the remains of some poor beast dragged away. Each time, he tightened his grip on Seryozha, knowing it was only a matter of time before the men's fury turned toward him if they discovered the truth. The cub grew larger, his playful yips turning into the first rough attempts at a howl. The sound thrilled Ivan but also filled him with dread. If the villagers heard it, they would know. Yet despite the fear, Ivan could not bring himself to push the cub away. The bond between them grew stronger with every day they shared. In the evenings, Ivan sat by the fire, and Seryozha rested his head on the old man's boots, eyes half closed in peace. In the mornings, the cub followed him outside, leaping through the snow, leaving tiny paw prints beside the trail of his cane. For Ivan, who had lived so long in silence and grief, the companionship was a balm he had not known he still needed. And though he told himself again and again that he was only keeping the cub alive until it was strong enough to return to the forest, deep down he feared that letting go would break him in ways war and winter never had. The wolves still howled in the distance, their voices carrying sorrow and hunger through the frozen air. Ivan listened each night, torn between dread and pity. He knew the pack was searching, mourning for what had been taken from them. Perhaps they knew their young had died by human hands. Perhaps they would never forgive. Yet as he sat in his cabin, one hand resting on the warm, breathing body of the cub curled beside him, Ivan chose to believe that mercy, though rare in this cruel world, still mattered. He had given it once, and he would give it again, no matter the cost. The winter tightened its grip on the valley, each day colder and leaner than the last. Snow piled high against the cabin walls until the windows seemed to stare into nothing but whiteness. Ivan's stores dwindled faster than he dared admit, and even the traps he set brought back little more than frostbitten air. Hunger gnawed at him quietly, but he bore it with the stubbornness of a man who had endured worse. It was not himself he worried for, it was Seryozha. The cub, no longer so small, was growing quickly. His paws seemed too large for his body, his teeth sharper each time he tested them on a strip of leather or a piece of bone. He needed more food, more strength, and Ivan could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. One evening, as the light faded into the blue of dusk, a sound shattered the uneasy silence. A howl, deep and resonant, rose from the forest. It was not far, it was close, too close. Then another joined it, then another, until the air itself vibrated with the voices of a pack. Ivan set down the log he had been about to throw into the fire and went to the window. Through the frost-blurred glass, he saw them, faint shapes moving among the trees, their eyes catching the dim light like sparks. The wolves had come down from the ridges. Seryozha, who had been gnawing on a stick by the fire, froze. His ears pricked forward, his body stiffened, and then, with a suddenness that made Ivan's chest ache, he answered. The sound was not yet a full howl, more a high, awkward attempt, but it carried across the room all the same. Ivan's blood ran cold. He rushed to the cub, kneeling to hush him, but the damage was done. Outside, the howling intensified, louder, closer, circling the cabin like a storm-given voice. The wolves had heard him. Ivan reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. His hands trembled, not from age this time, but from the knowledge of what was at stake. He did not want to fire it, not at these creatures whose grief he understood, but he also knew the danger of a hungry pack pressed by loss and snow. Seryozha twisted in his arms, restless, whining softly, his eyes alight with something wild and ancient. He did not see danger in the voices outside, he saw kin. For hours, the wolves prowled the edges of the clearing, their shadows slipping between trees, their cries relentless. The sound battered Ivan's heart with every echo. He sat near the fire with the rifle across his knees, the cub pressed against his leg, his thoughts tearing him in two directions. To keep Seryozha meant to defy the natural order, to risk the wolves, wrath and the villagers, fury. To give him back to the forest meant surrendering the only companionship Ivan had known in years. He thought of the pine tree and the cruel ropes, of how close the cub had come to death, and his chest ached with the memory. Without his intervention, Seryozha would have been nothing more than another frozen body swinging in the wind. How could he undo that mercy now? The storm returned that night, as if the sky itself sought to smother the earth. Snow came in furious sheets, lashing against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters until it seemed the wind would tear them free. The wolves did not retreat. Their howls cut through the storm, mournful yet demanding, calling to what was theirs. Ivan felt the weight of their cries deep in his bones. He remembered voices from his past, soldiers calling out in the night for comrades lost, mothers keening for children taken by hunger. The grief of the wolves was no less real. At last, Ivan rose. He knew the choice was no longer his to delay. Seryozha stood before the door, pacing, tail low, torn by the pull of something older than fire and walls. Ivan gathered his coat, wrapped it tight, and took the cub in his arms. "If this is the way of things," he murmured, "then let it be." His voice cracked, though no one but the cub heard it. With a deep breath, he unlatched the door, and the blizzard roared in, cold and merciless. Snow whipped into the room, stinging his face, but he stepped forward all the same. Outside, the world was chaos, wind howling, snow swirling, shadows shifting in the trees. The wolves emerged from the storm like wraiths, their eyes blazing, their teeth glinting white. Ivan stood tall despite the trembling in his legs, holding Seryozha close to his chest. He raised his arms, not to threaten, but to show he carried no weapon in that moment. Slowly, painfully, he bent and set the cub down in the snow. Seryozha hesitated, looking back at Ivan with wide eyes, torn between warmth and wilderness. The wolves advanced cautiously, their bodies tense, their growls vibrating through the storm. Ivan held his ground, though his heart hammered like a drum. He wanted to call the cub back, to scoop him up and run, but his voice would not rise past the lump in his throat. Then, as though a decision had been made within the cub's wild heart, Seryozha bounded forward through the snow. He was greeted by the pack, sniffed and nudged, their growls softening into whines of recognition. Ivan's vision blurred, whether from wind or from tears he could not tell. He stood in the storm, rifle forgotten at his side, watching as the wolves accepted Seryozha into their circle. The howling shifted, no longer a chorus of mourning, but something gentler, almost relieved. Ivan remained there long after the wolves retreated into the storm, their shadows swallowed by snow. The cold gnawed at him, the wind tore at his coat, but he did not move. His arms felt unbearably light, empty without the weight of the cub. When at last he turned back to the cabin, every step was heavier than the last, as though the snow itself sought to keep him from returning. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm, but not the silence that followed. For the first time in weeks, the fire's glow offered no comfort. He sat alone, staring at the blanket by the hearth, still creased where the cub had once slept. The cabin had grown larger again, emptier, the echo of the wolves' cries still lingering in his ears. The storm raged like a living beast, swallowing the forest in white fury, but Ivan walked on, his boots sinking deep into the snow, each step slower than the last. He held his coat tight, though it did little against the wind that tore at his body. Ahead, the wolves circled, shadows against the blizzard, their eyes glinting like embers in the dark. His breath came in ragged gasps, clouding before his face, but still he pressed forward, carrying the weight of his decision as surely as he carried his years. In his arms, he no longer held the cub. He had already placed Seryozha down on the frozen ground, between himself and the pack. The cub had stood uncertain for only a moment before bounding forward, answering the call that pulled at his blood. The wolves had met him with suspicion, their teeth bared, their bodies taut with anger and grief. But recognition was stronger than fear. They sniffed him, nudged him, and their growls faded into soft whines. Seryozha nuzzled against one of the larger wolves, a female with snow-dusted fur, perhaps his mother, perhaps another who would claim him as her own. The pack formed a ring around him, their eyes still wary of the human who had carried him here, but they did not attack. Instead, they lifted their heads and howled, a sound so raw, so mournful yet filled with relief, that Ivan felt his knees weaken beneath him. He gripped his cane for support, the storm lashing against him, tears freezing as soon as they touched his cheeks. Seryozha turned once, just once, to look back. In that brief glance, Ivan saw a spark of recognition, a memory of warmth and firelight, of milk drops on a spoon, of whispered words in the silence of the cabin. It pierced him through, more deeply than any wound he had ever taken in war. Then the cub disappeared into the moving mass of wolves, swallowed by his kind, and together they vanished into the storm. Their cries echoed long after they were gone, fading into the blizzard until only the wind remained. Ivan stood there, the snow already covering his footprints, until the cold bit so deeply into his bones that he feared he might not make it back. Slowly, heavily, he turned toward the cabin. Each step felt like walking away from something he could never reclaim. The warmth of the cub had left his arms, and though the storm pressed him hard, it was the emptiness within that weighed the most. When at last the cabin came into view, half buried beneath the drifts, he felt no relief. He entered, shutting the door against the storm, and stood in the silence of a home that suddenly felt larger, lonelier than before. The fire burned low, its glow flickering weakly across the walls. Ivan lowered himself onto his stool, the rifle still leaning against the wall, untouched. His eyes drifted to the blanket by the hearth, where the cub had once curled, small enough to fit in his palm. The creases were still there, the faint marks of tiny claws. He stared at them until his vision blurred, until the room itself seemed to waver between memory and reality. He reached down, out of habit, expecting to feel a warm body, soft fur pressing against his hand, but there was nothing. His fingers closed on empty cloth, and the emptiness clawed at his chest. Yet beneath the sorrow, there was a quiet peace. He had saved the cub once from certain death, and though it meant giving him back to the wilderness, he had ensured that Seryozha would not grow up in chains of rope and hatred. In his own way, he had done what he could not do for so many others, comrades lost on frozen fields, villagers starved in hard winters, even his wife whose breath had slipped away in a storm not unlike this one. He had saved one life, and in doing so, he had reminded himself that mercy still mattered, even when the world seemed merciless. The days that followed blurred together. Ivan tended his fire, checked his traps, and trudged through the snow, but the silence pressed heavier now. The cub's absence was everywhere, in the stillness of the mornings, in the long nights when the wind rattled the shutters and there was no playful cry to break the quiet. He found himself listening for howls in the distance, straining to catch some echo of the pack. And sometimes, late at night, he swore he heard them. A long, steady call, carried faintly through the frozen air. When he heard it, he would set down his tools, close his eyes, and whisper the cub's name, letting the sound rest on his tongue like a prayer. One evening, when the storm had cleared and the moon shone silver over the endless snow, Ivan stepped outside. The forest stood hushed, cloaked in ice, every branch glittering like glass. His breath hung before him as he looked out toward the dark line of trees. The silence was deep, vast, yet not empty. Somewhere out there, he knew, the wolves moved through the snow, strong and wild, and among them ran the cub he had once saved. Perhaps Seryozha had already forgotten him, his human warmth replaced by the strength of the pack. Or perhaps, in some small corner of his wild heart, he carried the memory of a fire-lit cabin and an old man's trembling hands. Ivan did not need to know. It was enough that he had given the cub back to life, even if it meant returning to loneliness himself. The snow covered his boots, the cold gnawed at his skin, but he stood there for a long while, his gaze fixed on the forest. When at last he turned back inside, he carried with him a strange sense of belonging, not to the village that scorned the wolves, nor to the wolves who would never trust him, but to the quiet truth that even in the harshest winter, mercy had a place. And though he was alone once more, he no longer felt forgotten.